Hey everyone, my name is Scruffy. Today we're looking to the next dungeon guide for the War Within, the Priory of the Sacred Flame. If you guys want to check out the whole playlist, including some raid guides as well, please make sure to check out my YouTube channel. For all written guides, like class guides, you can check out yourmmo.com. If you like these type of guides, I'm a guide writer for World of Warcraft and Path of Exile, and you find most of my guides here on my YouTube channel. If this might be your thing, I would really appreciate if you could subscribe and give this video a like. And without further ado, let's hop into the next dungeon. The first boss is Captain Dcry. He is surrounded by several mini-bosses. Each mini-boss shares their health with the boss, but they also buff each other up for 300% more damage. For that reason, we have to complete some objectives within the first boss area to lure these mini-bosses away from the boss. There are 3 mini-bosses, but there are only 2 objectives you can clear. But let's start with the trash on your way first. The Arati Footmans use Mortal Strike on the current tank and applying a healing reduction that can stack. Arati Knights cast Disrupting Shout, which cannot be interrupted, and deals damage to all players and silences them if they were interrupted while casting a spell. Impale is an attack against a random player, dealing damage and applying a bleeding debuff. Fervent Sharpshooter attack random players with pot shot and also leap to a random location sometimes and throw some traps on the floor. Stepping into them roots the player and deals damage over time. Fanatical Conjurers have the Fireball and the Flame Strike. Like regular mage abilities, this deals damage in a swirl when the cast is finished and leaves a Void Zone on the floor. Devout Priest use Greater Heal and Holy Smite, very familiar abilities. The Lightspawn uses Purification, channeling damage into one random player over 6 seconds and cannot even be interrupted. So, each mini-boss has its own abilities. We need to decide which mini-boss we let live and engage that one with the first boss together. To trigger Taina, you have to defeat High Priest Aimia. She is located in the south, indicated with a minimap icon. She uses Reflective Shield, creating an absorption shield and reflect damage back to players. And she also uses Holy Smite. Taylor Durmal himself casts Ember Storm, creating swirls on the floor to dodge, but he also casts Cinder Blast and Fireball on random players. Those 2 casts can be interrupted. So, if your group has a lot of interrupts, you should not trigger his event and fight Taina with the boss together. To trigger Elena Emberlands, you have to defeat Forge Master Damien. He is located in the north platform. He buffs himself with Seal of Flame, increasing his damage on by 50% and spawns lava pools around in the area. With Heat Wave, he pulsates for damage to nearby players and slows them a bit. The mini-boss, Elena Emberlands, uses Divine Judgment on the tank, dealing damage and causing his damage taken to be increased for 6 seconds. Repentance has to be interrupted. It would stun a random player for 8 seconds. And last, Holy Radiance pulsates damage to all players every 1 second for 8 seconds. If your tank and healer are fairly well equipped, you should leave this boss alive and fight her with Captain Dcry. And last, to trigger Sergeant Chainmail, you need to defeat Guard Captain Suleiman, who is located in the middle area. He uses Thunderclap to deal AoE damage and Shield Slam against the current tank to knock them away. Sergeant Chainmail himself attacks random players with Lunging Strike, dealing damage to those players and 5 yards around them, so make sure to spread a little bit. Brutal Smash deals heavy area damage and stuns players for 5 seconds if struck. This guy should never fight during the boss fight because he's fairly annoying. The boss abilities are pretty straightforward. Besides him and the other mini-boss sharing their health, but increasing it by 300% is already covered. Against the current tank, Pierce Armor deals heavy damage and applies a bleeding debuff. Captain Dcry also hurls his spear towards a random target, dealing physical damage to that player and all other players struck in its path. This can be dodged by all players, even the targeted one. Battlecry has to be interrupted, otherwise it deals very high damage to players and grants all his allies a damage increase of 50% for 30 seconds. And last, Savage Mauling. Captain Dcry jumps with his mount on a random player, rooting them in place and dealing damage every 0.5 seconds. This also creates a damage absorb on himself, which has to be broken in order to interrupt this cast. After the boss, you will encounter a few waves of enemies that you have to clear. Most of the enemies that you encounter are the same ones as before. Fanatic Conjurers with their Flame Strike and Devout Priest with their healing abilities. Ardent Paladin are new and use Divine Storm and Consecration, typical Paladin abilities that you're familiar with. They also use Sacred Toll, like Divine Toll for Paladins, dealing damage to all players within 50 yards, but this does not interrupt the players. After clearing 4 waves, containing almost similar mobs, we gotta fight Baron Brownpike. Baron Brownpike has a few abilities, which are always empowered when he uses Vindictive Wrath. Vindictive Wrath causes him to do 25% more physical damage, which are mostly melee attacks to the tank, but empowers all of other abilities. Because this enemy is a paladin, he uses the Paladin's Avenger Shield. Castigator's Shield launches a bouncing projectile onto 3 players that deals damage to them, slows them, and spawns a large Void Zone below each player hit. This Void Zone explodes, dealing heavy damage to players struck. During Vindictive Wrath, this will bounce onto 5 players. Brownpike sometimes casts Burning Light, and if not interrupted, it heals the boss by 40% of his health and deals heavy damage to all players. And during Vindictive Wrath, the cast time for this is reduced. The boss also casts Hammer of Purity on one random player, indicated by a swirl on the floor. This then spawns spiraling hammer that deal damage to players coming into contact with them. As you might have guessed, during Vindictive Wrath, this affects all 5 players, not just one player, so make sure to spread far away from each other. And last, missing the footage and the reason, but Brown Pie creates a sacrificial pyre, like statues containing 3 charges. Each time a player comes into contact with the pyre, a charge is consumed and the player is affected with sacrificial flame, taking damage over 5 seconds. We currently assume that you can most likely dodge that pillar, but if not, let each player soak a charge and use a defensive cooldown. From here, on your way to the last boss, you encounter a large hall with the same enemies as before. This is the first dungeon in the War Within where enemies are just repeating, but in this dungeon we have already had a lot. Risen Mage is new and casts Fireball Volley that has to be interrupted. Coming already to the last boss. The Sacred Flame is a laser beam that chases one player and leaves a void zone in its path. Players coming into contact with the beam or with the void zone gonna take heavy damage. Blinding Light is a 4-second cast that deals damage to all players, but also disorients all players that are having their characters facing the boss. Make sure to turn your character around, not just your camera. Coming to the boring abilities, Holy Smite deals damage to your current target, inflicting holy damage, but can be interrupted. Holy Flame is a dispellable debuff on a random player that deals damage to all players within 8 yards around that targeted player. And sometimes the boss will buff herself with Inner Fire, increasing her damage stun for 10 seconds and pulls that heavy damage over time to all players. This requires some strong healing output. When the boss reaches 50% health, Merprey jumps upstairs and shields herself with a large absorb shield. While she has this shield, she cannot be interrupted and channels Embrace the Light, dealing increasing damage as long as she casts this. While players are trying to break the shield, several Arathi neophytes will run towards players, putting heavy damage around them, but they're also losing health themselves every 1 second. So the further your group is away, the lower the odds will be when they reach you. The boss then just continues with her regular abilities from phase 1.